Thank you, David. Thank you, David. Um, I think as David mentioned earlier, we talked a lot about diversity and or inclusion. They were discussed in about every presentation. Diversity isn't just a necessity in today's world. It's a smart business strategy to allow us to learn and to grow from multiple and differing perspectives. It's acknowledging and really celebrating the differences in gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, race, age, physical disabilities, religious belief, and other ideologies. The CPCU Society has always provided a safe and welcoming environment for everyone to be involved and actively works to promote good diversity and inclusion practices across the industry, including encouraging chapters to hold meetings on this very issue. And as we watched earlier, Sharon Coaches, our president, mentioned that goal number 3 involved diversity and exclusion for 2022 to 2024. It is my sincere pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Vida Thomas, partner at Oppenheimer Investigations Group, LLP. She has practiced employment law for more than 2 decades and conducted well over 200 workplace investigations. She is very experienced in Title IX, Title V, the Public Safety Officer's Procedural Bill of Rights, and the Firefighter's Procedural Bill of Rights. Vida also brings her experience in investigating matters within a union setting and is adept at investigating complex matters involving high-profile employers and individuals. She serves as a hearing officer in employee discipline appeal hearings. Vida frequently trains attorneys and human resource professionals on how to conduct workplace investigation. Vida also conducts diversity and inclusion training, and we are lucky to have her speak to us on that topic today. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Vida Thomas.
Hello, everybody. Hi. I'm Vida Thomas. I'm really delighted to be here with you today. And can someone just confirm how long do you want me to speak? I'm starting a little early, so is it okay if I go to 2:40, or would you rather I do something shorter? I can adjust depending on what your needs are, and I want to respect everybody's time. Any sense?
Yeah. You could go to 2:40, Vida.
Okay. Yay, that's a good thing. But I could have made it shorter if I had to. Let me go ahead and share my screen, make sure that everyone can see my presentation okay. Let's see, let me start. Did everyone see that all right? Perfect, perfect. All right. Well, this is one of my favorite topics to present on. I do speak on a large number of topics. That's what a lot of lawyers do, but unconscious bias has become one of my favorite topics to present on, partly because I think it makes people nervous. It can make people uncomfortable. Having to discuss your own beliefs, sometimes feeling that someone's accusing you of being racist or sexist or misogynist. And so what I'm going to assure all of you as I speak with you today is that I'm not coming from that perspective at all. I am coming to you without judgment. And what I'm asking you to do in exchange is to approach this topic with an open mind, right? With an open heart, a desire to really examine yourself. After all, each of you is alone. Nobody has to know what's going on in your head. So as you view these slides and as you listen to this information, I really encourage you to really ask yourself those serious questions. And hopefully after today's presentation, you'll be encouraged to start a lifelong journey of learning, understanding your own biases, and taking the steps necessary to reduce them. And it is really a journey. And so we're going to cover a number of things today. I'm going to give you lots of definitions about what unconscious biases are, because people use those terms pretty loosely sometimes. How do our biases impact our decisions and interactions? That's really the reason we're all here and why we're listening to this topic. And it indeed, even though biases are unconscious, not intentional, they can still have very real effects on the people around you. And then finally, what can we do to maybe eliminate is too strong a word. I don't know that we can ever completely eliminate biases, but we certainly can do things to reduce our biases significantly. And that's the good news, that once you're aware of a particular unconscious bias, that's the trick, bringing it from your unconscious to your conscious mind. There are a number of things that we can do to reduce them, and I want to talk about those with you. And so whenever I start a conversation about unconscious bias, I love to ask this question. Maybe if I do this next year, we'll all be in a room together. And so I can ask you, raise your hand if you went into your line of work to be unfair, or if you want to go through life being unfair. And I suspect, as is always the case, no one raises their hand. And I don't think any of you would say you want to be unfair. In fact, fairness is a fundamental desire of all human beings. If you've ever raised children or taught children, you know from a very young age, one of their first laments is, but that's not fair. And that's because we want fairness on a very fundamental level. So we all start from the premise that, of course, I want to be fair. The problem is these things called unconscious biases are operating in the background as we make multiple decisions a day. Because of the biases, there's information we miss. There's information we overemphasize, and it may turn out that in spite of our conscious desire to be fair, because we're not really examining and dealing with our own unconscious biases, our decisions perhaps are not impacting everyone fairly. Lots of definitions about what biases are. I think it's important for us to make sure we're on the same page as we have this discussion today. Is a bias a preference? Some people use the word bias when they mean a preference. Is it a stereotype? Sometimes biases come from stereotypes. We'll talk about that in a little bit. The difficulty with biases is that sometimes they're based in reality, some real experience that we had that our minds then extrapolate to generalize about everything or person in that category. But sometimes they're not based on reality. They're based on myths and lies about persons and tendencies. And so it's important to know that. So I'm not talking about preferences when I talk about bias. You know, you might have a preference for a color or a type of car or a type of sport. Is that a bias? Well, it's not the type of bias we're talking about because it doesn't impact people in the way that the unconscious biases that I'm talking about will. And so these are differences than biases, and it's important to understand that. Where does bias come from? Lots and lots of studies about this. I encourage you to research this topic. It's very rich, richly researched by psychologists and social scientists who agree for the most part that our biases come from our environment, right? One of the biggest influences in our environment, especially in this country, is media, the media we consume. And now when you add on top of that social media, meaning information that's not even put out by professional media organizations anymore, right? Any one of us with a computer, even a cell phone and a Wi-Fi connection can become a media publisher. And all of that information that we consume is sending messages to our unconscious mind, messages we're not even aware of consciously. Our experiences through life create unconscious biases because our brain, in order to protect us and help us navigate through the world, understands you can't experience every single possibility in the world. So you have to be able to take the limited experiences you have and extrapolate and generalize to help you predict what's going to happen in the future, right? Well, the brain overdoes that. And that's where stereotypes and biases can come from. The people around us, they shape our unconscious biases. Based on their experiences, they tell us what we can expect from different people in different situations in life, things that we've observed in our lifetime and the assumptions we make based on what we see. All of that goes into the subconscious. And the danger is that you're not aware of it, and yet it's impacting you in ways that we're going to discuss in a little bit. When you're receiving this information and you're thinking about the information, I strongly urge you to resist the not me effect, right? Not me I'm a woman, so I couldn't possibly say or think something sexist. Not me, I'm married to a Jewish man, so I couldn't possibly be anti-Semitic. Not me, I grew up with my best friend being African American or Latino or gay, and so I couldn't possibly be or think things that are racist or homophobic. The fact of the matter is, yes, you and me and all of us, we all have these human brains that store information in our subconscious and that we can act upon without being aware of it, even though what's in our subconscious may be the exact opposite of what we believe consciously. That's the thing to understand. Having subconscious thoughts that are harmful doesn't mean you're a bad person. It just means you're a person with this vulnerable, well, magnificent yet vulnerable brain. Okay, so having biases doesn't make you a bad person. And if you can accept that, then open yourself up to examining your unconscious biases, because studies do show just acknowledging a bias is a very important first step towards reducing the bias. You know, that idea that you can't improve something that you don't acknowledge. You can't fix a problem that you don't acknowledge. And studies show that someone who explicitly knows they have a particular bias, as painful as it might be for them to admit that to themselves, they then show less bias. That's a really important light bulb moment. Acknowledging, oh, I engage in a stereotype about women that's untrue, or about men, or about this or that. Now you've brought it out of your subconscious into your conscious mind, and now you can work to reduce it. So I'm really encouraging you to do that. I mentioned stereotypes before as one source of unconscious biases, and it's really important to understand that stereotypes are powerful, very powerful, because they help us make mental shortcuts, right? Limited information, we need to make a decision right now. Stereotypes help us presume what we think what will happen and act accordingly. They're also very harmful. Even positive stereotypes are harmful, because when you engage in a stereotype, you're not seeing the person, you're seeing the group that they belong to. So even if you hold a stereotype, for example, that someone of Asian descent would be better in math. That sounds positive, but why would you make that assumption? You're judging all Asians by that one standard. Black men are better athletes, the stereotype. Well, that's not a positive stereotype if you apply it to an individual, because again, you're judging that person by the group they belong to. There are all sorts of stereotypes that are made about men, right? All men are physically strong. All men are emotionally resilient. Well, that sounds positive, but it places a great burden on men to be physically strong, and emotionally resilient in situations where it's not reasonable to expect them to be that. And to give men less freedom to express their emotions and to feel certain emotions, and how will that impact a man emotionally? So the idea is, whether it's positive or negative, it's harmful, because it's trying to force people into boxes in which may not be very comfortable for them naturally. The other thing to know about stereotypes is this concept called stereotype threat. A lot of research about this as well. But what studies have shown is that someone who's in a group about whom there's a negative stereotype, that person starts exhibiting the very negative characteristics of the stereotype. Just being exposed over and over again to the idea, for example, that girls aren't good at math. A girl who's exposed to that negative stereotype, before long, she will start doing poorly in math, unconsciously behaving in ways that are consistent with the stereotype. No matter how much her parents might tell her, girls are just as smart as math. If she's getting all these other negative messages about girls being bad in math, studies have shown she's going to perform less well in math than she otherwise would. So really be careful about stereotypes. They can be very harmful. One type of stereotype here is in this riddle. The man, you may have heard of it, a father and a son are in a car accident. The father is killed. The son makes it to the emergency room. When the surgeon comes into the operating room, the surgeon says, "I can't operate because this is my son." And so the question is, well, how can that be if the father died in the car accident? And the answer is because the surgeon is the boy's mother, because the surgeon was a woman. And this riddle is meant to expose the stereotype that many of us still hold, which is that when we think of a surgeon, we think of a man. If you thought of a man and you sort of couldn't figure out this riddle, that doesn't make you a bad person, but it's helpful to know, even though consciously I know men and women can be surgeons and just as competent at surgery, I still defaulted to that gender stereotype. And now you can bring it into your consciousness and say, I'm going to work on that. I'm going to remind myself of ways in which this stereotype is not true. Right now, another layer to this riddle is today, in today's world, actually, the surgeon might be a man because this boy may have had two fathers. So see how the world evolves and stereotypes that we had before sort of fade away, and we have to let in new information about how society changes and how the world changes. I just love that example. Again, stereotyping comes from our brain trying to help us, trying to make us more efficient. We can't possibly process all of the input that comes into our brains. So we have to let in just small snippets, learn from experience so that we can predict the future. It's the way our human species has survived as long as it has. So it has very, very good impacts or effects, but there's this residual effect that can be really harmful. Okay. Another helpful example of how to understand how the brain might help create biases because of what we see and what we don't see is this video that I want to show. Some of you may have seen it. It may be new to the rest of you, but in this video, you're going to see people in black shirts passing a basketball to each other. And then you're going to see people wearing white shirts and they're passing a different basketball to each other. And so what I want you to do, I want to see how well you can pay attention. How many times does one white shirted team member throw the basketball to another white shirted team member? Let's see if I can get this lock to play. Wow. Oh. Well, let's see. Let me go back. I apologize for that because we're not going to get to see that. But here's what I can tell you. Go online and Google basketball video and watch it and see what you learn about how the brain operates when you're focusing on something. All right, I apologize for that video being missing. Technical glitch there. So there are ways in which your eyes can sort of fool you. You're so focused on looking for one thing that you don't see something else that's there. The same thing can happen with how we hear, right? And so here's a question that should be pretty easy for all of us to answer. How many of each animal did Moses put on the ark? Right? We all know where we are. That's a familiar one. What's the correct answer? 0 animals on the ark? 1 of each animal on the ark, or 2 of each animal on the ark? Okay, well, those of you who said 2 are wrong. Those of you who said 0 are correct because Moses didn't put any animals on the ark, which was the question you were asked. It was Noah who put the animals on the ark. And so what happened there, you might wonder? Well, again, it's your brain trying to help you by making shortcuts. You saw the ark, you saw animals, and you thought, I know where we are. I know this. I know this universe. And so you heard me say how many animals did Noah put on the ark when I actually said Moses. And in our work lives, it's helpful to think about how often might that be happening? How often might we not be taking in the entire picture, right, of what's actually there, what's actually happening, because we're filling in the blanks with what we think is being asked, what we think was said. This is one reason why, in criminal investigations, when eyewitnesses are interviewed, the stories can be all over the place because each of them is being impacted by some of these dynamics, what they expected to see, what they were focusing on, and therefore didn't see other things, or what they thought they heard based on what they expected to hear. So in your work life, as you're evaluating employees, if you're in a position to do that, are you seeing everything that's there of the employee's performance? Are you hearing everything, or are you only taking in what you're subconsciously expecting to see or hear? We're going to have some cool examples of that, right? Another quick test, again, this is just to open you up to the idea that a lot of this is the brain doing this automatically. look at this slide, and for each word, you can say this to yourself. I want you to say the name of the color you see, not the word that's being spelled, right? So the first word is blue, followed by green, followed by red, and then you can read the rest of them to yourselves. See how easily you're able to do that. Okay. And if you're like most folks, you were able to do that pretty easily. Let's try it again with just a little twist. Again, I want you to say to yourself the color that you see, not the word that's being spelled. Okay, so the first one is blue, not green. The next one is yellow, not red. Huh? Yeah, I see some of you laughing because it does take you a little bit longer to do it. You're able to do it, but it takes you a little longer. Why is that? Well, that's because different parts of your brain are being asked to work at the same time, and they're receiving conflicting information. The part of your brain that recognizes color is different from the part of your brain that decodes language. And they were receiving two different answers, right? Now you were able to synthesize those two things and figure out the answer, but it took a little longer. And that's similar to what you're going to be doing in this journey of unlocking your unconscious biases and really managing them and reducing them. Your brain's going to be in conflict a little bit. You're going to be falling back on habits, right? And you're not going to get it right the first time, whether you've decided I'm not going to use this term anymore to refer to this type of person because I now learned that that's offensive. You're going to make a mistake. You're going to blurt it out accidentally. But if you can exercise the discipline to immediately follow up by saying, oh, I know that's wrong. I'm not supposed to say, hey, girls, when I run into a group of women, I'm supposed to say hello, something else that doesn't imply that I think they're juveniles, right? Or I'm not going to use this term, or I'm not going to use that term. You just have to practice and you'll get it. You really will. And so since I'm encouraging you to try to determine your own unconscious biases, let's talk a little bit about how you might go about doing that. I'm going to talk to you about a test that you can take. And I'm going to walk you through the steps that you would be going through in taking this test. So as a first step, answer to yourself, how biased do you think you are when it comes to young people versus old people? Do you think you have a strong, moderate, or slight preference for young people over old people? Do you think you have no preference at all between the two? Or do you think you actually have a slight preference, a moderate preference, or a strong preference for old people over young? Which one do you think? Pick a lane. What do you think honestly about yourself? And hold on to that. Because the individuals who put together this test I'm going to share with you, they do this millions of times, actually. And so on average, a random person who's asked to answer this about himself or herself, here's how the statistics fall out. Nobody believes they have either a strong or moderate preference for young people over old. Only 5% think they have a slight preference for young over old. The majority of people think they have no preference at all. And then the largest group percentage, 58%, think they actually have a slight preference for for old people over young, okay? And then those individuals who did this self-assessment, they're given this computerized implicit association test. And as you can see, the computer score is exactly the opposite of what people think about themselves, right? That the vast majority of people who take this test show or demonstrate some type of automatic preference for young people compared to old people. Yes, there's still some who have no preference, but it's much smaller than what they thought. Remember, they thought 37%. Really, the test showed it's only 14% of us who have no preference. And a tiny 6.4% have some type of preference for old people over young. And so you might ask, what's to explain this difference between how people perceive themselves and what this test actually shows? But if you think about our society, it makes a lot of sense, right? What do we tell ourselves consciously? We value our elderly, right? They are our institutional wisdom, right? They are an experience. They've given so much and they deserve this, that, or the other. They've earned so much. They've done so much for our country. We value them so much. But if you turn on a television or go online or turn on a radio or consume any kind of media, you will be inundated with commercials about youthful serum, be more youthful, wrinkle rid, age defying, age stopping, age ridding, be young, more energy, right? There are supplements that I won't explicitly name that are supposed to bring back youthful vigor. We are a youth obsessed culture, right? We tell ourselves we value age and wisdom, but we fight it with every fiber of our being. Clearly, as human beings, at least in this country, we have a clear conflict of how to feel about aging. And that's what this test, the makers of this test, believe they've uncovered, right? And so the test is the Harvard Implicit Association test, which I'm going to show you in the next slide. And I'm going to encourage you to take it if you want to start examining some of your biases. Another helpful tip that I use for myself when I'm trying to figure out, did I make that decision because I have a bias? And I just ask myself, well, if this person were in the opposite category, would I think the same thing or would I reach a different conclusion? If I wouldn't think the same thing, if it was someone in the opposite category, then that's some evidence that maybe it's bias at work. If I can say, no, even if it was a man in the case of a woman, or even if this person was straight and not gay, even if this person was this race or not, I would still think their performance was flawed. I would still think they shouldn't be hired. I would still think XYZ. Then that's a good way to check yourself, right? But you have to be honest. That's the key. This is a conversation between you and you, no one else. And so you have to be honest with yourself. And sometimes I know that can be difficult. So what's this Harvard Implicit Association test I told you about? Well, it's a computerized test. So if you go online, if you just type in Harvard Implicit Association test, I think there's a link on the next slide too. You will get into their platform and you get to decide what category of people do you want to test yourself against, right? So you could test whether you have an implicit association, a preference for or against Black faces versus white faces. We talked about old people versus young. There's one about size, skinny people versus larger people. And there are a bunch of other categories that you can test yourself for. And what the test does, it asks you that self-assessment, like the one we took before. Answer for yourself. Do you feel you have a mild, moderate, or strong preference either way? And then you take their test, where they show you faces in each category, quickly followed by positive words, then also quickly followed by negative words in a randomized kind of way that makes sense to their algorithm, but which you supposedly can't hack, if you will, or can't manipulate. And it's measuring how quickly do you click a Black face after a positive word? How quickly do you click a Black face after a negative word? And then reverse it. How quickly do you click a positive word after a white face, a positive word after a Black face, on and on and on, and all sorts of combos that supposedly you can't trick the test. And the computer puts that through an algorithm and comes up with a ranking. Do you show that you have any kind of preference one way or the other? To encourage you all to do this and want to see the results, I'll share with you. I took this test maybe 8 years ago. I decided to test myself for whether I had any kind of preference for Black faces over white faces. And based on my test results, I had a slight preference in favor of white faces over Black faces. And I share that with you because I want to emphasize that unconscious bias is this tricky thing. Now, here I am, a 55-year-old Black woman who consciously does not believe there's any difference between the races, doesn't believe one race is superior over the other, thinks we're equal. I don't harbor conscious negative thoughts about Blacks, and yet I'm in the same environment we're all in. I'm exposed to the same media, the same experiences of the people in my group. And so somehow in my subconscious, there came this slight preference for white faces over Black faces. It gave me a moment to think. I had to really think through, where did this come from? And I had to work on it. And so just to let you know, it happens to all of us. It doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't mean that you have conscious biases against people. It means that that sneaky little thing called your unconscious has some stuff in there that you need to excavate, bring forth into the light, right? Sunshine is the best disinfectant, and start that work of reducing your biases. Okay. So I don't want to oversell the implicit association test. It has its critics. You know, they have the secret algorithm that's taking your little mouse clicks and coming up with this answer. Most importantly, a preference is not the same as a conscious prejudice, right? So don't mix up those two. It's just saying that there's something in your subconscious that if you don't deal with it, it can leak out without your knowing, and it can cause some harm to people. So again, I've just said this. It's unconscious. It doesn't make you a bad person. But what the test studies show is that most of us have an implicit or unconscious bias against members of traditionally disadvantaged groups, racial minorities, transgender individuals, LGBT individuals. And so my own test was a sign of that. I'm a Black person, but I had a slight implicit bias against Blacks in general. So that supports that conclusion. How do biases impact us? And because I'm an employment lawyer, I'm interested in how it impacts the workplace. And there are tons of studies that track this. I'm just sharing a few of them with you. You probably have heard of these resume studies that the EEOC and other organizations will do. This one, they sent identical resumes. Everything about the resume was absolutely identical except the name at the top of the resume. One was a traditionally African-American name like Tamika Jones. The others had a traditionally white name like Emily Ryan. They were sent in response to Help One ads to see what happened to these resumes. And this study showed that the white names, the white sounding names, received 50% more responses across the board. This result has been replicated so many times, folks. I mean, tens of times these studies go out and they come up with the same result. What's going on, right? I don't think it's that the person who screens the resumes looked and said, oh, Tamika Jones, she sounds Black. We don't want to hire Black people. I don't think that's what happens. What the studies suggest is seeing Tamika Jones, something unconscious is triggered, some recognition that this might be someone of African American descent. And what that does, remember the Noah's Ark example, the person now subconsciously starts looking for problems, right? Starts looking for reasons why this might not be the strongest candidate. That desire isn't triggered by the traditionally white name. So this is all happening on the subconscious level. And the person, if the screener would say, no, I didn't screen out African Americans on purpose. I don't believe that would be a good thing to do. And yet something subconscious is happening. Those of you who, like me, love classical music, you may be aware that it's now pretty standard that orchestras hire through a blind audition practice. That wasn't always the case, but orchestras across the country started noticing that even though women were graduating with master's degrees in music fields, almost as much as to the same extent or in the same percentages as men, the orchestras themselves had very, very few women, which made no sense. And so someone came up with the idea, maybe there's something about the audition process where some bias is leaking in. And so they came up with the blind audition process, right? The judges are sitting in the seats, and up on stage, there's a big screen so that you cannot see the gender of the person who's auditioning. All you can hear is the quality of their playing. And this study showed that doing so increased the probability that a woman would advance from the preliminary rounds by 50%. That's huge. And increased the likelihood that she'd be selected several times over. Now, I've heard a little story, I don't know if it's true, that at some point, there still seemed to be some bias leaking into the process, and someone figured out, oh, we can still figure out the gender of the person walking on stage because of the shoes and the footfalls, right? And so subconsciously picking up on a clomp, clomp, clomp was a man, and a tap, tap, tap was a woman. And so I was told that there were certain orchestras that will tell the musician, take your shoes off, so that we can't hear that. I don't know if it's true, but it was certainly comport with this idea that we're taking in information into our subconscious that's impacting what we perceive. Now, don't think that lawyers are somehow immune from these processes, these biases. We're humans just like the rest of you. Yes, we might be trained to be logical and methodical and deliberative, but we still are susceptible to biases. And so in 2014, the American Bar Association did something similar to that hiring survey. They created a memo, a legal memo that had been written by a hypothetical associate, and they deliberately inserted 22 errors. You can see there from that first bullet. They then sent this memo to partners in law firms telling them that they were participating in a writing analysis study. Please rank the quality of this legal memo from a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the best. Half the partners were told the memo was written by an African-American male associate. The other half were told that it was written by a white male associate. And the white male associate received on average a 4.1 out of 5. The African-American male received a score on average score of 3.2 out of 5, which is significantly lower on a scale of 1 to 5. And what was the explanation for this? When they went back and they looked over, how the partners had scored the memo, more errors were found in the memo that was thought to be written by the African-American, even though the one purportedly written by the white associate had the very same errors. Remember, I was telling you this about the screening of the applications. It's not likely that it's the partner set up, written by an African-American man, must be bad. But knowing that it was written by an African-American man made them look at it more closely. And so ask yourself that. We're going to talk about some other related concepts. If you're evaluating people, managing people in your workplace, whether it's because someone's of your group, and so you feel more affinity for that person. They're a woman like you're a woman, a man like you're a man. They're of your race or your ethnicity, or grew up where you grew up, or went to the same college, or pledged the same sorority or fraternity, or have these things that make you identify with that person more. Are you perhaps not evaluating them as harshly as people who aren't in that category? It's a very real thing. And so it's especially if you're in a position of authority where you're evaluating folks, you're making decisions about whether what compensation, whether people are promoted, what assignments people get, then you owe it to your organization, right? You owe it to those people over whom you have some power to ask yourself these questions. Am I really evaluating folks fairly, notwithstanding my personal situation with these individuals? Because all of that stuff can leak into your subconscious. There are some other ways that implicit bias can operate. I want to talk with you a little bit about confirmation bias, observer effects and priming, something called the halo effect, anchoring, and this idea of intuition versus deliberation. I think most of you are most familiar with the term confirmation bias. Of all these terms, I hear people use it a lot more. It's the tendency to sort of form a hypothesis or a theory, and then from that point forward, you only notice the information that confirms your theory, and you don't really notice or pay attention to the information that refutes your theory. It's a very natural operation of the brain. And this symbol on the right side of the slide is a classic example of confirmation bias. If you read the symbol from top to bottom, the middle character appears to be the number 13. But if you read the symbol from left to right, the middle character appears to be the letter B, right? So wherever you start impacts what you see moving forward. That's the idea of confirmation bias. I love this quote attributed to Lord Molson. I will look at any additional evidence to confirm the opinion to which I've already come. And that's what confirmation bias is saying. I'm open-minded to receive the information that confirms what I believe. And folks, we do this so much. And the advent of social media makes it so easy. Look, we get to select the media we consume. And it's just a natural human tendency to limit yourself to the media that confirms your beliefs, your existing beliefs. It's very difficult to say, oh, I'm going to go watch the TV show of the person I completely disagree with. That'll be a fun exercise. Most of us don't have the discipline to do that. And I think one of the reasons is revealed in this slide. They've done MRI studies trying to catch confirmation bias in the act, so to speak. And what those show is once you've come to sort of a hypothesis or a pre-conclusion, when you are confronted with contrary information, the reasoning centers of your brain literally shut down. They can see that on an MRI. Your brain is literally saying, I do not want to see that because that makes me uncomfortable. By contrast, when you're shown confirming information, right, that's consistent with your beliefs or your hypothesis, the emotion circuits light up. And so imagine that's what we're sort of getting these little dopamine hits every time we read a tweet that confirms what we believe, every time we go online and we see something that confirms or corroborates our beliefs, that actually makes us feel good. And by contrast, hearing our opinions disputed or contradicted makes us feel bad. But it's worth it to go through that discomfort to make sure that you're getting all of the information, okay? Here's a scary thought. I used to think fingerprint analysis was a completely objective science. I've learned since going to law school that it's not. But what's scary is that in a criminal justice context, fingerprint experts can be vulnerable to confirmation bias, right? If the officers who bring the fingerprint to the expert tell that expert, we think this is the guy, but you, or woman, but you confirm that with your expertise, that fingerprint expert is much more likely to find a match than if the fingerprint expert is told, we don't think this is a match. Just that piece of information ahead of time can influence what that expert actually sees. Now that's a potentially life or death decision that's being influenced by confirmation bias. The decisions you make most likely wouldn't have a life or death impact, but they can seriously impact someone's life. And so it's necessary for you, again, to go on this journey to assess whether you are engaging in confirmation bias without knowing it. And we're going to talk about some steps you can take to do that. Also in the criminal context, an interesting study that was done, participants were told, you're going to see some information that came out in a trial, but before that, here's the crime that was committed, and we want you to hypothesize who committed the crime before you see any of the evidence, right? So what were they trying to do there? They're trying to get folks to create a hypothesis ahead of time, right? And so the study confirmed that doing that caused the participants to look for reasons to find their identified candidate guilty and ignore evidence that tended to exonerate. Okay. So halfway through the study, some of the participants are asked, well, I know you think it was Vida who committed the crime, but can you think of reasons why you might be wrong? Look through the evidence and see if there's reasons why you might be wrong. Another group of participants were simply told, I know you think it was Vida, but can you think of anyone else who might have done it? Well, it turned out that first group, who were asked to sort of stop and explain why they might be wrong, then showed less confirmation bias, meaning many of them changed their minds. Like, oh, now that I stopped, thought about why I might be wrong and looked through the evidence again, I come to a different conclusion. That's a big clue. We're going to talk about how this would impact you in the workplace later, but building in time for reflection, building a way to stop confirmation bias from happening and re-examination is really a big key towards stopping this process. Let's see, a few more of these. Observer effects and priming are sort of the same thing. It's this notion that when you're observing something and you think you're doing that in a neutral state of mind, like you're observing it in an open-minded state, you may not really be open-minded if you were first primed with information before the observation. So a couple of examples. This is really so analogous to the work situation. The participants who didn't realize they were part of the study, they were college students in a room. And they were told, there's an assistant who's going to come in and help you get set up for what we're about to do. And a certain group of some participants, this was done over and over again, in some of the groups, the participants, before the assistant came in, accidentally, air quotes, overheard two people discussing this assistant and saying very negative things about her. Oh, she's so rude. She's so this. I'm so sorry they're having to deal with her. Oh, well. And then the assistant would come in and interact with them. And after she was gone, the students would be asked, please rank this person on a scale of 1 to 10. Another group a third group who overheard the negative information were then told, oh, I'm sorry, you weren't supposed to hear that. We weren't talking about your assistant. We were talking about someone else. Okay. So it's between those three groups. Those who weren't told anything negative about the assistant ranked her at a 9.33. Those who overheard something negative, much lower score. Even though you could show by videotape, the assistant did nothing different as between the groups, right? He or she behaved exactly the same, said exactly the same words and exactly the same tone. Most interestingly, those who were told to disregard it, it didn't really help as much as you would think. They still, they didn't score her as high as if they hadn't heard anything negative about the assistant at all. By the way, in the criminal context, their understanding, this is why you hear that you can recall this dramatic moment in a trial on TV where a witness says something and the attorney says, objection, Your Honor, the witness wasn't supposed to say that. And the judge says to the jury, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, please disregard what this witness just said. Well, studies show not only does that not work, it actually backfires. And during jury deliberation, the jury can't help but focus on that thing they were told not to focus on because they were told to focus on it. So and the criminal justice folks are trying to figure out, okay, how do we address this other than just saying, please disregard it? Is there another way that we can unring a bell? But that's the point of this. You can't unring the bell. Once you hear something negative about someone, it's going to impact how you observe them from that moment forward. This is why our parents and our grandparents always said, but first impression is a lasting impression. So do everything you can to make a good first impression on someone, because we all understand instinctively it's very difficult to counteract a bad first impression. Flatworm study doesn't involve people, but same concept. When people are told to observe these little wiggly flatworms and count how many times they wiggle around, a group that's told that this is a very active group of flatworms counts 5 to 20 times more wiggles than are actually caught on camera. And conversely, those who were told this is a very sedate group of flatworms count 5 to 10 times fewer. They see what they expect to see, even though objective video evidence shows exactly what occurred. Again, when someone transfers into your unit, what's one of the first things you'll do? You'll pick up the phone and talk to the old supervisor and say, tell me about this person who's moving into my unit. What do you think about him or her? And if they tell you this person's stellar and wonderful and you'll love him or her, chances are you're going to like that person. If that's what you're going to see. You're going to observe the things that confirm what you were told. If you're told this is a slacker and a complainer, you're more likely to notice that aspect of the person's performance. So keep that in mind whenever you managers have conversations about employees, that you could be influencing each other and not really seeing what's actually there. Anchoring is sort of similar. To understand how this works, really think of the word anchor. When a boat or ship drops an anchor, the boat will still move, but it is not going to move very far from that anchor. That's the whole point, right? Same thing here. That first piece of information we receive about a situation or receive about someone, it's going to act as an anchor. And yeah, our opinions are not going to stray very far from that first piece of information. Similar to priming, but a little different. It's most at play in settlement negotiations. This example of how judges who are supposed to be objective still susceptible to this. When they're told a certain amount that the plaintiff is asking for, the judge who settles that case is going to settle it close to that number. If they're told nothing about if they're not given a number at all, they're going to settle it for significantly less. That's why in negotiations, you spend so much time obsessing over what should our opening offer be, because you know once the opposing side hears your first offer, they're not going to move too far from that. So you don't want it to be too high or too low based on what it is you want to get. Halo effect. We tend to think people who have some positive physical attributes, good looking, tall, have all sorts of other positive attributes along with it. They're smarter, they're nicer, they're more capable, even though we know objectively that's not the case. And so this is just a tongue-in-cheek question. Maybe that's why most CEOs are above average in height, because we associate height with intelligence or with competency. Conformity effects, similar. We tend to think people who have higher status are better people, are more trustworthy, are more competent. And we tend to think people who have lower status are less so. And so if you have a job where you have to judge and assess people in different statuses, socioeconomic statuses, keep that in mind. It's an unconscious bias that the CEO is smarter than the janitor. The CEO is more trustworthy than the janitor or the secretary or the receptionist, even though we know intellectually that's not true, but we tend to take the word of the CEO over the word of the janitor if there's any kind of dispute. And so you want to keep that in mind when you're evaluating situations. There's this question of how people make decisions. Do they make decisions by deliberation or intuition? Most of us like to think we deliberate. Of course, I don't just fly off the handle and do whatever feels right in the moment, but the reality is not so much, depending on the circumstance. And one way you can measure your tendency to make decisions by deliberation versus intuition is to take the CRT, the cognitive reflection test. And it's a very simple test. You're given 3 math questions, very easy math questions, okay? It's a multiple choice. And each of those questions has a correct answer that's easy to come to if you just slow down and think about it. Each question also has an incorrect answer that's easy to come to if you're just instinctively answering it. And you take these 3 questions and you're scored on 0 to 3. Did you get 0 right, 1 right, 2, or 3? The higher your score, the more you tend to make decisions by deliberation. The lower your score, the more answers you get wrong, the more you tend to make decisions through intuition. And over time, what these responses show is that ordinary adults can do both. And intuition tends to dominate our deliberative process, our decision-making processes, but we can overcome it if we just slow down and deliberate. And here's an example of a question. I apologize to any math folks. Don't break out in hives. It's really not that bad. A bat and a ball cost $1.10 in total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Okay. Does the ball cost 5 cents? I'll even let you see it again. A bat and a ball, $1.10 in total. The bat costs $1 more. How much does the ball cost? 5 cents, 10 cents, 90 cents, or $1? Well, if you said 10 cents, you are wrong. If you said 5 cents, you are correct. And so these 2 examples help you see that. The example on the right explains why 10 cents is the wrong answer. Okay. They add up together, they add up to $1.10, which was one of the requirements. But if the ball is 10 cents, then the bat is only 90 cents more. And it needs to be $1 more. And the only way that works is if the ball costs 5 cents. So if you took out paper and pencil, you'd see that. But what most people do is the same thing with the Noah thing. $1.10, $1. I think I'm going to be asked to tell the difference, to calculate what's the difference. 10 cents, boom, that must be the answer, right? And so that's all this is showing you. Again, I love to point out examples where those of us in the law are no better than anybody else. Remember, this highest score is a 3, the lowest score is a 0, and judges scored 1.2 out of 3. Not very well, slightly higher than University of Michigan law students, slightly lower than Harvard law students, suggesting judges tend to favor intuition over deliberative faculties, which makes a lot of sense. Judges have to make hundreds of decisions every day without a lot of time to deliberate because their dockets are so heavy, and they tend to see recurring types of cases come before them. And so all those circumstances make it very tempting to say, I know what this is. I know this fact pattern. I know the answer to this question. It's been asked of me 10 times. Here's the answer. So it's not a ding. It's just an interesting example. On a more sobering note, though, there are lots of studies that show how inherent biases, implicit biases can impact folks in the legal system in very negative ways. A number of studies, including this one, showing that violent felons in Detroit, Black and white judges imposed harsher sentences on Black defendants than white ones. And remember, it's not just white judges, it's Black and white judges. Remember my example that stereotypes can be held even by the person in the group being stereotyped? That my example of my implicit association test result. So this is another instance of not giving into the not me, right? A Black judge might say, well, not me, I'm Black. So how could I, how could I give out sentences that are harsher on Black defendants? Well, it's because implicit biases are at work. Another study showing that judges set 25% higher bail for Black defendants than similarly situated white defendants, meaning same crime, same rap sheet. Sentences 12% longer for Blacks than comparable whites. Again, same or similar crime, same or similar rap sheet. The last bullet gave me a lot of pause. We used to think that the biggest predictor of whether a murderer, a convicted murderer would be sentenced to death, the biggest factor would be what's the race of the defendant, right? If it's a Black defendant who's convicted of murder, he's more likely to be sentenced to death than a white defendant. But it turns out, no, it's the race of the victim that plays the biggest role in whether a death sentence is meted out. If the victim is white, much more likely that the defendant, whether the defendant is white or Black, much more likely that that defendant will be sentenced to death. And that's that study there. Okay. Now, what's operating here? Is it blatant bias against certain groups, or is it actually bias in favor of someone's own group, something that we call my side bias? And that's often what's at play. As I alluded to before, there are certain people I'm more comfortable with, tend to be the people who share my own characteristics. And so I find it easier to identify with those individuals. And if I'm a judge, I'm going to find it easier to identify with a criminal defendant who matches my characteristics. Same thing with employment decisions. So it's not necessarily hostility towards people in a different group, more than it's a comfort with people of your own group and showing them favoritism as a result of that. Okay. So that's really important to remember. Again, you may not harbor conscious biases against people, but it might be just favoritism that can affect all of these things: who gets hired, who gets plum assignments, who gets promoted. How do we reduce bias? The good news is we can. And the most important thing to do is expose yourself to different types of people, right? When you expose yourself to that person who's different from you, find things that you have in common. That's the neat thing about exposing ourselves to people who are different from us. We start learning, oh, the differences aren't really that big. They're married just as I'm married. They have an annoying teenager just as I have an annoying teenager. They're having marital problems just like I'm having marital problems. They worry about money just as I worry about money. They might go to the same type of religious institution I go. You have more in common than you think. Try surrounding yourselves with images that defy stereotypes, right? If you have negative stereotypes about men or women or people in a particular racial category, find images of those folks in positive circumstances so you can defy those stereotypes. Have relationships with different types of people. And when you do that, make connections and focus on the positive. In the employment arena, we talked about blind selection processes, redact applicant names or other identifying information so we're judging everyone on the same level playing field. We developed a criteria before we make the decision, okay, by creating job descriptions, predetermining the interview questions, predetermining the rating criteria. In the workplace, we have rules of conduct first, and we compare people's behavior to the rules of conduct. So we're not arbitrarily deciding what type of behavior is permissible or not. And build in a robust review process. Remember that study about if you're asked to reconsider your decision and why you might be wrong, that can stop the process of confirmation bias. That's what you want to do in your own decision-making processes, whether it's hiring, whether it's disciplining, whether it's firing, whether it's promoting. Stop yourself, maybe bring in another person to re-examine the information you're looking at and see, am I seeing everything that's there? Maybe my colleague might see something I'm not seeing and might be able to point out to me something that I missed because I was in the thralls of confirmation bias, all right? So the good news is there's lots that you can do, and I encourage you all to take these steps. I'm happy to stay if folks have questions. If you want to put them in the chat box, I can answer them there. But otherwise, thank you all so much. I've really enjoyed presenting. I hope that each of you came away with something that you can use moving forward.